Hello and welcome to Topic 6, Lecture 1. And in this topic, we're going to be learning about reproduction and public policy. And in this lecture, we're going to be focusing on contraceptive policy. Okay, so with Topic 6, we finally start our exploration of public policy. And as noted on the previous slide, the public policies that we're going to be focusing on this week have to do with reproduction. Yay, we finally made it to actually getting to digging in to look at specific public policies. And so from this point forward, each week will be dedicated to exploring a different aspect of public policy. Now, this is the last topic that we cover before our midterm exam. And so your midterm exam will be due on October 26th. So this week is dedicated to reproduction, and then we dedicate a whole week to working on the midterm exam. I just do it that way because I don't want you to be doing course content, quizzes and reading and, doing discussions and also taking an exam. That's an overload. I want you to kind of like have a little bit of a breather and, feel like you're coming into this exam, with a little bit of a, rested and ready to go. Then we'll be having a study session to go over concepts for the midterm exam. We'll talk more about that next week. And then you'll receive your questions, I think on October 22nd, and then they're due on October 26th. And it is an essay. It's a take-home, open book, open notes exam. So just wanted to mention that, as sort of a prelude of what to expect as we're moving forward in the next week or so. So what we're going to be taking a look this week is we're going to be examining the public debates and policies associated with reproduction. And so that we'll be learning about the public policy around contraception. And contraception, as most of us know, is the methods that we use to prevent pregnancy. And then abortion is the policies associated with terminating a pregnancy. So we have two lectures this week. The first lecture that we're doing here is going to be focused on contraception, and then the second lecture is on abortion. And then your discussion for this week is also about, can we find a middle ground on abortion? So let's get started. Today, it can be pretty easy to manage reproduction. That due to access to contraceptives, that when you plan to get pregnant, it's a choice that you make, right? That it's a choice that you make with your partner, and you're basically saying that, you're ready for starting a family. And that's what was known back in the early part of the 20th century as voluntary motherhood or free motherhood. It's the idea that you choose to get pregnant. And that also, because of contraceptives and reliable forms of contraceptives, not only do you choose parenthood, but that you can have sex without concern about getting pregnant. And so that today sex is delinked from reproduction, that you can have sex for a lot of reasons of your choice, to become closer to somebody, for just pleasure, for whatever reason. But that if you're using contraceptives, and most of the contraceptives are reliable these days, that you can have sex without worrying about getting pregnant. This idea of voluntary motherhood is a relatively new phenomenon. For most of history, women and men had very little reliable control over reproduction. Contraceptives were used, but they weren't as reliable as the contraceptives that we have today, in particular contraceptives that modulate hormones in order to prevent pregnancy. And so for most of human history, that when you had sex, the chance of getting pregnant was in the forefront of your mind. And that also that you really didn't have a lot of control about when you start your family, that you were sort of left to the whims of the body and the whims of less reliable forms of birth control. So as we noted, voluntary motherhood is a relatively new phenomenon. And that Margaret Sanger, who you might be familiar with and you're going to be reading about in the textbook this week, that Margaret Sanger, she was an American birth control activist. She was a sex educator and a nurse. And that she, as in that position as being a nurse and being fighting for birth control for women, she really witnesses the hardships that were associated with involuntary motherhood, the hardships that were associated with not choosing to become pregnant. She opened the first birth control clinic in the United States in 1916. And as you can see in this picture of her on the side, that she held meetings, public meetings where people could come and talk about the importance of having access to birth control. And so as she was witnessing the problems associated with involuntary motherhood, she basically identified a problem. She said that as long as women and families in general don't have control over when they reproduce and if they want to reproduce, that really presents a lot of hardships for families. But it particularly presents hardships for women, because women, when they have sex and get pregnant, they're the ones who bring the baby to term. And so for Sanger, controlling reproduction was key to equality and freedom for women, that you can't pursue your educational endeavors or your economic endeavors, or really can't be in a relationship and realize the kind of freedom in a relationship that you want if every time you have sex you're worried about getting pregnant. And so for Sanger, she really wanted to bring access to birth control to families and to women in particular, because she really felt that it was a key to women's liberation. Now, as a birth control advocate, Margaret Sanger received many, many letters, thousands of letters from women that were contacting her about the issues that they were facing because they couldn't control their reproduction. And these were harrowing letters of women who were really stressed out and really talking about how they really couldn't be their best mothers because they really couldn't have any control over the number of kids that they were having. And so she published some of these letters in this book called Motherhood in Bondage, as a way of sort of drawing attention to, focusing, setting the agenda, drawing attention to some of the problems associated, the serious problems associated with involuntary motherhood. And here's a quote from one of the letters that's in the book. A woman wrote to her and said, "I have 3 children and I'm expecting another shortly. And the oldest was just 3 years old last month. So you can see my plight. If there's something very sure that can prevent the coming of another child for many years, I'd surely be thankful to you. I'd like to rest. To tell you the truth, I'm only 21 years old, and I'd like to enjoy myself a little while I'm young. Also be a playmate to my children instead of just a cranky, impatient, nervous, tired mother, if such a person could be called a mother. I don't feel that I could call my mother that if she felt and acted like I feel." And so that really encapsulates, a lot of the concerns that people had about lacking access to contraceptives. Okay, so your textbook identifies 3 phases of policy that reflect how contraception is defined by society. Keep in mind, earlier in the semester when we were talking about public policy, the public policy is oftentimes a reflection of the values of the society at that time period. And as those values change, then public policy will oftentimes change as well. And we'll see those changing values and goals as we look at these different phases of contraception. So the first phase we'll be talking about is when contraception was treated as obscene materials. Phase 2 is when contraception was treated as a prevention or a treatment for disease. And then phase 3 is when contraception was treated as a tool for family planning and personal choice. So let's dig into each of these phases more deeply. Okay, so prior to the 19th century, contraception was really regarded as a private matter. That people use contraceptives. People have been using contraceptives for thousands of years. But it wasn't seen as an issue that needed to be tackled by government, or that there didn't need to be policies in place to sort of regulate the distribution of contraceptives. And this is sort of a reflection of the separate spheres doctrine. This idea that women have their private sphere and men have the public sphere, and that what goes on in the women's private sphere, information and distribution of sorts of herbs and objects that can prevent contraception from taking place, that's in the women's sphere. You just leave that alone. There's no need for government to get involved in that regulation. That changes early in the 19th century, or actually in the mid 19th century, in the 1850s. And it's at that point when the distribution and production of contraceptives enters into the public debate. In one way, it enters into the public debate because it's seen as a means of controlling population. And so it's sort of like we should have access to contraceptives. At least certain people should have access to contraceptives because we want to control the population. There was a rising, this is a time period where we have rising immigration in the United States, and that there's concern that the wrong people are here in the United States and the wrong people are reproducing. So it's kind of a eugenics concern, really, that you want to use contraceptives in order to keep sort of the race pure by giving contraceptives to the people who shouldn't be reproducing. So that's one way that contraceptives enters into the public debate. The other way that contraceptives enters into the public debate is that there's this, at least for some people, this perception that there's this more growing moral degeneration, and that sexual and social purity is being threatened by the increasing access to contraceptives. Because contraceptives aren't regulated by the government, you could import them into the United States. You could create them and distribute them. You could give people information about them. There were no regulations on contraceptives, and some people felt that was bad. And it's kind of a perception that developed out of the increased urban population and the perceived negative features of cities. That in cities, that, as we're going to see in a second with the Comstock Act, and Anthony Comstock was the one who brought this to the public's attention. He walked around the streets of New York, and he saw a lot of prostitution and a lot of lewdness, and he was like, man, we can have this prostitution and lewdness because people get information about contraceptives, and contraceptives are sort of about learning about sex, and that's really degrading the moral fabric of the United States, and therefore we should do something about it. So the lack of regulation of contraceptives increases moral degeneration, and action must be taken. The first federal law, or the first law that we have in the United States that deals with the regulation of contraceptives, is known as the Comstock Act. And it was passed by Congress and signed into law in 1873. And we have this gentleman here, Anthony Comstock, to thank for that law. Anthony Comstock was a devout Christian, and he fought in the Civil War. He grew up in a rural area in Connecticut in the in the 1840s, right? So that he fought in the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, he moved to New York City. Became a salesman. Okay, he was selling items. And when he lived in New York City, and again, he's a devout Christian, and he comes from a rural part of America. Then when he gets to New York City, he's shocked at what he thought New York City was this place of moral degradation. He saw prostitutes on the street corner. He saw the distribution of pornography. He saw a lot of lewd activity, and he was just shocked, and he wanted to do something about it. And so basically he brought it to the attention of the federal government that there was this, pornography that was being distributed. There was prostitutes, and he thought that had to do with sex trafficking. And he also felt that information about contraceptives was basically pornographic. He was shocked that you could look at a pamphlet and it would tell you, this is how you would use a contraceptive, this is how you would insert it or put it on. It would show the nasty body parts from his perspective, and he was just utterly freaked out. And so that he brought this issue to the attention of the federal government, and the federal government did something about it. And what they did is they passed the Comstock Act. And what the Comstock Act is that it defines contraceptives as obscene and illicit material, and that it makes it, and as such, that you cannot use the mail or you cannot distribute contraceptives between state lines because Congress has the authority over prohibiting the distribution, the dissemination, and the importation of illicit and obscene material, and contraceptives was deemed as falling in that category. So basically, the impact of the Comstock Act made it very, very difficult to get access to birth control couldn't be imported into the United States. It couldn't be transported between state lines, and you couldn't get any information about birth control because all that information was deemed as obscene and illicit material. It was basically like, we need to bring chastity. It was considered the chastity law. We need to bring chastity back to the United States, make a consequence for having sex, and you can't have access to birth control. And that's the only way that we can bring like social and sexual purity back to the United States. And the states got on board with this as well, and they adopted a bunch of little Comstock acts that were basically prohibited the production and the dissemination of birth control and information about birth control. And those state versions of the federal law were adopted by 24 states. So the Comstock Act started to be challenged at the beginning of the 20th century. And Margaret Sanger, who we already talked about, the birth control activist, she starts challenging the Comstock Acts in court, but she is not successful in the challenges that she's making against these laws. That she realizes that she needs to shift her approach. That she was initially arguing that the Comstock Acts were unconstitutional because they violate the rights of women. But she realized that that argument wasn't getting a lot of traction. People didn't really care that much about the rights of women. So she realized that she needed, if she wanted to bring down the Comstock Act or to weaken it, she needed to come up with a new approach. And the approach that she comes up with is the so-called medical loophole. She said her thinking is that if she could find a way for medical doctors to be able to distribute contraceptives, then that would kind of whittle away at the Comstock Act, because you'd find all these medical exceptions within the law. And by making it easier for people to get contraceptives, it would like basically weaken the power of the Comstock Act. So that is the approach that she took. She said to change the laws, don't focus on the freedom and rights of women, because that doesn't seem to be a very popular or politically persuasive approach. Instead, focus on the rights of male doctors, and that the male doctors have a right to treat their patients as they see fit, and that the federal government or state governments shouldn't interfere with the right of male doctors to treat their patients. And that would apply to everything, including the right to prescribe birth control. The approach to focus on the rights of doctors as a means of bringing and weakening the Comstock Act was successful. This approach was successful. And it appealed to two powerful interest groups in society. Keep in mind that when we're changing policy or wanting to weaken policy in order to bring about new policy, you need a policy community, a network of political actors who work together in order to challenge existing public policy and to bring about new public policy. And so there was a policy community that developed. The Margaret Sangers of the world, who were wanting to have more birth control access in order to give more rights to women. Doctors who wanted to have more access to birth control in order to more effectively treat their patients, and nativists, those who are opposed to immigration in the United States because they wanted to keep the United States looking like the people who lived here in the original 13 colonies, that they got on board too. So Margaret Sanger said to doctors, hey, if you help me weaken the Comstock Act, then that means that you're going to have more clients, more people will come to you for birth control, you'll be able to make money, and also you'll be able to work on new forms of birth control, like a hormone pill, and that you could make money by doing that. And the doctors were like, giddy up, we'll help you weaken the Comstock Act. Nativists too. Margaret Sanger appealed to nativists, saying, look, we know that that immigrants are here, but we know you don't want them to reproduce because you want to keep America white. And so therefore, work with me to make it easier to get birth control pills, and therefore you can satisfy your demands and desires to prevent immigrants from reproducing. And they were like, giddy up, we'll help you with that. Now, Margaret Sanger has gotten a lot of trouble or a lot of shit for aligning with the nativists at this time period, because basically their message of anti-immigration and eugenics was abhorrent. So why would Margaret Sanger align herself with that? Well, she shouldn't maybe have aligned herself with that, right? But she saw the greater goal of getting more access to birth control as worth, making alliances with people that she did not agree with. But it will always be sort of a negative mark on her historical record. That these groups presented legal challenges to the Comstock Act in the court, and they were successful. In 1918, the court said that women could use birth control for therapeutic purposes that were prescribed by their doctors. In 1938, the court said that or 1936, the court said that doctors could use the mail to distribute contraceptives. And so these legal challenges greatly weakened the federal Comstock Act. Now, keep in mind that many states adopted like state versions of the Comstock Act. And so there were many states that had these state level Comstock Acts prohibiting abortions. And so in many states, birth control and access to birth control was impossible to come by, and that using birth control was a crime. And New England residents, the states in New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, etc., those areas were the areas that had the most restrictive the most restrictive contraceptive laws in the country. In Massachusetts, anyone disseminating contraceptives or information about contraceptives faced stiff fines and imprisonment. And Connecticut had one of the most restrictive laws on the book. That in Connecticut, even the act of using birth control was prohibited by law, and married couples could be arrested for using birth control in the privacy of their own home. Now, for the most part, law enforcement just looked the other way, right? You have a law in the books. It doesn't mean that law enforcement is actually going to enforce these laws. But regardless, these laws still were on the books in these states, and that those who were wanting contraceptives to be legal were wanting for these laws to be challenged in the courts. And so Margaret Sanger and those who are affiliated with Planned Parenthood, that they returned to Margaret Sanger's original goal. And that original goal is that access to contraceptive is about freedom. It's about a freedom, a right to privacy that you have, that women have, and that families have, and that the government shouldn't interfere with. And the 1960s was a fertile time for this shift, right? Because the 1960s is a time where we see rising civil rights concerns. The civil rights of African Americans, civil rights of women, the civil rights of gay and lesbian folks. And so there was, this sexual liberation time. And so the time period was right zeitgeist, so to speak, for these changes in policy. Planned Parenthood was at the forefront of shifting the terms of debate back towards liberty, privacy, and autonomy, and that these Comstock Acts, both the federal Comstock Act and the state Comstock Acts, were deemed unconstitutional in the landmark case Griswold versus Connecticut. So let's take a quick look at that case. So in 1879, Connecticut, like many other states, adopted state versions of the Comstock Act. And in 1878 in Connecticut, they passed a law that banned the use of any drug, medical device, or other instrument in furthering contraception. Okay, so basically you couldn't disseminate it, you couldn't give advice about how to use it, and even if you were using it in your marital bedroom, that was against the law. And so two people wanted to challenge this law. One was a gynecologist from the Yale School of Medicine. His name was C. Lee Buxton. And that they operated, a birth control clinic was opened in New Haven, Connecticut, and with the help of Estelle Griswold, who was the head of the Planned Parenthood of Connecticut. And so they opened this birth control clinic with the absolute, the reason that they did that is because they wanted to challenge the Connecticut law criminalizing the use of contraceptives. Because you can't have a case come to the Supreme Court unless somebody challenges that law and actually gets in trouble for challenging that law. And so they open the clinic. They are soon arrested and then convicted of violating the state law. I mean, they weren't put in prison or anything like that, but they, were convicted of violating the law. And that's what they needed in order to challenge this law in court. The higher courts affirmed their convictions, and then they finally made a petition to the Supreme Court of the United States in order to hear the case. and the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case in Griswold versus Connecticut. Here are just some pictures. Here's Estelle Griswold outside of the Planned Parenthood clinic in Connecticut. Here is Estelle Griswold and her friend, and they're looking at the newspaper when the decision from Griswold versus Connecticut comes out. And here's one of the protesters outside of the Planned Parenthood clinic that says, "The law is the law, or is it? Morality is in danger." So those same concerns that Anthony Comstock had in the 1870s were still alive and well in the 1960s in the great state of Connecticut. So the question that was before the court in the case Griswold versus Connecticut was, does the United States Constitution protect the right of marital privacy against state restriction on a couple's ability to be counseled in the use of contraceptives? In other words, does a law saying that it's a crime to use contraceptives in your own bedroom to get information about contraceptives from a doctor, is that type of law unconstitutional? And in a 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court of the United States said yes. The Comstock Act and all the little Comstock Acts that were in place at states are a violation of the constitutional right to privacy and are therefore null and void. So let's dig into the ruling in Griswold and talk about why it's important. Well, one of the reasons that Griswold is important is that Griswold establishes the right to privacy and basically says that the right to privacy is protected by the Constitution of the United States. You might think, well, why? Of course, the right to privacy is protected by the Constitution of the United States. But when you actually look at the Bill of Rights, and that's the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, there's no articulation of the right to privacy. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say Congress cannot abridge your right to privacy. It's just not there. However, in Griswold, they basically said that the right to privacy is in the Constitution. And that right to privacy, I'm moving forward here, that the right to privacy, while it's not specifically articulated in the Constitution, that it can be found in other rights that are included in the Bill of Rights. It's not explicitly in the Constitution, but when you look at the First Amendment that says you have the right to associate, when you look at the Third Amendment where it says that you have a right to, for the government can't put soldiers in your house, when you look at the Fourth Amendment that says you have a right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure, and then when you look at the Ninth Amendment that says that just because a right isn't listed doesn't mean that that right isn't granted to the people, they basically said that when you take all of these rights together that are articulated in the Bill of Rights, that's where you find the right to privacy. It's found in the penumbras of the right of the Bill of Rights. That is, that when you take all of these amendments and you put them together, a shadow is formed, and that shadow is where we find the right to privacy. And so it's important because it establishes that there is a privacy in the Constitution and that it's constitutionally protected right, that the freedom to make certain decisions about our bodies and our private lives without the interference from government, that's constitutionally protected. It also says that it's a fundamental right, that the government has to have a really good reason for violating your right to privacy. And it basically provides a framework for other cases dealing with reproduction. So coming out of Griswold versus Connecticut, we now know that you have a constitutional right to use contraceptives, to get information about contraceptives, and to, distribute information about contraceptives. That is a constitutionally protected right. What we're going to be talking about in the next lecture is whether or not this constitutional right to privacy extends to the right to terminate your pregnancy. In other words, is abortion also a protected right that you have under the established right to privacy? So following Griswold versus Connecticut and the constitutional establishment of the right to privacy, you have a constitutional right to use and access and have information about contraceptives. So today, the main policy issues regarding contraceptives have to do with access to contraceptives and the affordability of contraceptives. Now, under the leadership of President Obama, when he was president of the United States, Congress passed this, Obamacare, which you all are sort of familiar with. It is that's known as the Patient Protection and the Affordable Care Act of 2010. And what the Affordable Care Act establishes is that if you have insurance, right, everybody needs insurance, and all insurance providers have to cover a group of what are known as essential healthcare benefits, right? That if you are providing insurance, that your insurance has to cover certain things to no additional cost to the person who has that insurance. So if you pay your insurance premium, you get these essential healthcare benefits that are covered. And a part of the essential healthcare benefits are contraceptives. So the Affordable Care Act requires that private health insurance cover 18 different methods of contraceptives. And these are methods that you can get just as a part of having health insurance. There aren't any additional costs to them. And so that's a really great step forward in terms of access to contraceptives. However, that there's been some pushback on the essential healthcare benefits of the Affordable Care Act. The Trump administration and the Republicans in Congress at that time tried to get rid of the essential healthcare benefits, but they weren't successful in doing that. There have been requests for religious exemptions. So the famous Hobby Lobby case that basically said that providing contraceptives to their employees was against their religious beliefs, so they should be exempt from the Affordable Care Act, and the Supreme Court actually did carve out a religious exemption for them. And also there's been a move to defund Planned Parenthood in the United States. Since Planned Parenthood is one of the biggest purveyors or providers of contraceptives, if we defund Planned Parenthood, then that has an implication for access to contraceptives. So those are just some of the public policy concerns and issues that we are facing as it relates to contraceptives today. Thanks a lot for listening. I appreciate your time.